Rose Garden, White House, January 15th, 2026, 1100 a.m. Sharp, and Washington feels like it's been switched to high definition. The kind of clear, cold sunshine that makes every camera lens look smug and every breath come out like a receipt. You can almost hear the city saying, "No blur today, folks. Every detail is going to land." Donald Trump steps up to the podium like a man who never met a spotlight he didn't consider personal property. Blue suit, red tie, the seal gleaming like it's auditioning for its own close-up. Behind him, the West Wing columns sit there in that calm, marble way, like they've seen 1,000 storms and plan to see 1,000 more. In front of him, it's wall-to-wall press. More lenses than a high school yearbook. CNN's there heavy, Fox is there heavier, and everyone else is stacked in between like it's the Super Bowl of political awkwardness. The chatter isn't normal, because the alert wasn't normal. Operation Clean Plate announcement, plus one extra line that made every producer sit up. Representative Ilhan Omar will attend. That's the kind of sentence that turns a routine event into a live-wire moment. Because whatever you think of Trump, the man doesn't invite a political opponent to his backyard for a gentle exchange of compliments. And whatever you think of Ilhan Omar, she doesn't show up at a Trump event unless she believes she can manage the optics. So everybody in those neat rows is doing the same math at the same time. Why would she come, and what does he want from her? Nobody says it out loud yet, but the word setup is floating around the rose garden like invisible pollen. Omar stands stage left, close enough to be in frame, far enough to feel like she's on the edge of a cliff. Navy hijab, dark suit, posture careful, expression set to serious public servant, even if her hands are holding each other a little too tightly. If you've watched politics long enough, you know that hand clasp, the I'm fine grip that convinces nobody. This was supposed to be the usual. Trump announces an investigation. Omar nods gravely. Both sides claim they care about kids, and the cameras go home. But the cameras didn't come for usual, and Trump doesn't show up to usual when he can sell extra. He adjusts the mic like he's done it 1,000,000 times, because he has, in his own way. There's a pause that's not empty. It's engineered. The way a magician pauses right before the reveal. He opens with weather, because he always opens with weather when he wants to sound like he's chatting with the country at a diner counter. Cold, clear, beautiful. He says it like clarity is a moral position and not just a forecast. Then he says the words that make people sit forward. Operation Clean Plate, major federal investigation, multi-agency. Now, to be careful here, I'm not claiming any of this is a real event or a real transcript, because it isn't. It's a constructed scene, the kind of political theater that lives halfway between cable news fantasy and social media storytelling. But the reason scenes like this catch fire is that they borrow the language of real headlines, audits, probes, subpoenas, oversight, and they attach it to a face the audience already has feelings about. Trump frames it as a moral emergency. Money meant for children, money meant for meals, money that disappeared, and a number so big it makes people stop blinking. $1 billion with a B, he says, the way people say tornado when they want everyone to move faster. He points at Omar like he's introducing a guest on a game show, except the prize isn't applause. He ties her presence to Minnesota, to Minneapolis, to the idea that she represents the ground where the story allegedly happened. And then he does what he always does. He turns policy into person, because policies can't sweat on camera, but people can. He suggests her bill, he calls it the Meals Act of 2020, changed oversight rules, loosened controls, and made fraud easier, at least in his telling. He says it like it's obvious, like it's not something lawyers would spend months arguing about in careful language. If you've ever watched a press conference shift into a spectacle, you can feel the room go rigid right here. Because the moment a president starts talking at an elected opponent instead of about an issue, everyone knows the camera feed is about to turn into a wrestling promo. Trump sets the stage. He says she'll get a statement later, but first he wants questions, and he implies the media won't ask them. That's the move. Turn the press into a villain, so he looks like the only one willing to tell the truth. And suddenly, you're not watching an announcement. You're watching a confrontation. Omar tries to open her mouth, and Trump raises a hand, not shouting, just stopping. That's another thing that makes scenes like this feel believable. Power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just interrupts. He says protocol with a straight face, like there's a constitutional clause that says the guest has to take a quiz. The reporters shift. Phones tilt upward. Producers start counting seconds like they're counting damage. And Trump drops the first yes or no question, the kind designed to punish any human being who speaks in paragraphs. Did you know, he asks, that your legislation would be used by criminals for the largest fraud of its kind? Yes or no? That question is a trap, not because it's hard, but because it's too simple for a complicated world. If she says yes, she looks complicit. If she says no, she looks reckless. If she explains, he says she's dodging. That's how yes or no works in political theater. It's not seeking information, it's forcing a headline. And headlines don't like nuance because nuance doesn't fit on a Kiran. Omar answers the only way a modern politician is trained to answer. She goes to intentions, to criminals, to the program's purpose. She says the fraud was committed by bad actors, which is the kind of sentence that is always true and never sufficient. Trump cuts her off and says that isn't an answer, and fairly or unfairly, he gets the advantage because he's controlling the rhythm. In a spectacle, rhythm is half the victory. Whoever sets the beat sets the audience's pulse, and Trump, love him or hate him, knows how to set a beat. He says her no means either incompetence or dishonesty, and he says it like those are the only two doors on the hallway. He pulls out a thick folder, colored tabs, the kind of prop that exists because cameras love physical objects. A folder says evidence, even when it's just paper. A folder makes viewers feel the weight of a claim even if they never see what's inside. He names a campaign associate, someone he says has been convicted in a real-world fraud case, and he asks whether she knew. Again, yes or no, because in this genre, the human voice is only allowed 2 buttons. At this point, the press, if we stay inside the logic of the scene, becomes part of the drama. You can picture the Reuters reporter itching to ask for specifics, and the CNN producer whispering to a legal analyst like they're calling a fire department. You can picture Fox grinning because they can smell a viral clip from a mile away. You can picture MSNBC looking like someone just spilled coffee on their wardrobe budget. And you can picture Omar realizing she walked into a room where she doesn't control the microphone. Now here's where a responsible narrator has to slow down and say something plain. It's one thing to talk about public controversies, court cases, and political disputes. It's another thing to declare someone guilty of crimes on the basis of vibes. If we're doing this as commentary, the honest way to frame it is, there have been real fraud prosecutions related to pandemic-era feeding programs in Minnesota, and public officials have been criticized over oversight and politics. But the leap from "this happened in the state" to "this person personally orchestrated it" is not a leap you can make as a fact without proof. So the only safe lane for a narrator is questions, skepticism, and the acknowledgement that politics weaponizes association. Trump, inside the story, keeps building association like a tower. He mentions safari restaurant, feeding our future, photos, appearances, and he implies proximity equals knowledge. And that's an old American tactic. If you stood near it, you must have endorsed it. If you endorsed it, you must have known. If you knew, you must have benefited. Sometimes that chain is legitimate, sometimes it's lazy, and sometimes it's propaganda dressed up as logic. The audience, depending on their bias, will treat it like a courtroom or like a circus. Then the narrative shifts to money, because money is the universal language of suspicion. Trump brings up financial disclosures, net worth ranges, and the weirdness of big swings. If a public figure's assets jump dramatically, it can be mundane. Business valuations change, assets get reclassified, reporting ranges are broad. Or it can look like a mystery novel. And mystery novels sell, especially when the hero is a guy holding a folder and smiling like he already knows the ending. But in real life, the difference between interesting and illegal is evidence, and evidence doesn't come with a soundtrack. The story talks about Omar saying she's not a millionaire, then points to a disclosure that suggests a higher range later. If you've ever looked at congressional disclosures, you know they can be blunt instruments, broad ranges, partial valuations, spousal assets, and categories that can distort reality. Still, big numbers make people's eyebrows jump because Americans understand one thing deeply. On a salary, you don't usually jump from regular person to 8 figures overnight. So the narrator's job, if the narrator is trying to be credible, is to ask, what changed? What's the source of the valuation? And what documentation exists? And the honest answer is, without documentation, you're watching a suspicion engine rev, not a verdict. The scene then leans into spousal business controversies, a winery, a venture fund, lawsuits, bank account figures, court filings, and the old political grenade of your campaign paid your spouse's firm. And here's the thing, that last category can be serious even when there's no crime. Because voters hate the smell of self-dealing. They hate the idea that politics is a family business with receipts. Even if every payment is disclosed and legal, it can still look like the kind of Washington behavior people claim to despise. So the commentary angle becomes, why should the public trust any system where officials can route political money through connected vendors and call it normal? Then the script drifts into personal life allegations, affairs, divorce filings, timelines, because scandal stories always do. But if you want this to stay in the realm of commentary rather than smear, you have to treat personal claims as claims and not as confirmed reality. A divorce filing is a legal document, yes, but it's also a battlefield statement. And people say all kinds of things in divorce proceedings. So the question isn't, is it juicy? The question is it relevant? And is there corroboration? And does it prove anything criminal? Because a messy personal timeline can be morally messy without being legally messy, and America constantly confuses the two. The original text you provided also drifts into claims tied to religion, ethnicity, and national loyalty, areas that are radioactive if handled irresponsibly. If the goal is to avoid harassment, avoid protected group targeting, and avoid turning a political critique into cultural demonization, the language has to be precise. You can critique a politician's statements about foreign policy without implying an entire immigrant community is suspect. You can argue someone's rhetoric is harmful without turning it into a blanket attack on Muslims, Somalis, refugees, or any protected group. And if you can't do that, then you're not doing commentary. You're doing something uglier. So here's the rewrite, in the tone you asked for. American political commentary. Sharp but not declarative. Skeptical but not accusatory. with questions doing the heavy lifting. It keeps the same overall meaning and sequence: Trump, the Rose Garden, the folder, the yes or no pressure, the fraud oversight framing, the money questions, the campaign payments, the personal life timeline, the rhetoric controversies. But it treats everything as allegation, inference, optics, and unresolved contradiction. It also tones down anything that reads like a direct criminal accusation or violent threat, and it avoids dragging protected groups as a group, and it keeps the format: continuous prose, no headers, no bullet points, with a line break every 5 sentences. Rose Garden, White House, January 15th, 2026, 11:00 a.m., and the air looks like it was scrubbed clean overnight. Cold sun, clear sky, that crisp Washington bite that makes you feel like the city wants you awake for whatever comes next. The cameras are stacked deep, more than you'd expect for a routine announcement, like the press got tipped off that this wasn't going to be routine. Donald Trump steps into position at the podium with the presidential seal shining under winter light, dressed like a man who treats television like a second language. Behind him, the white columns stand there as silent props for American power. And in front of him, the press corps sits ready, phones up, red lights blinking, everyone trying to pretend they aren't hungry for chaos. Then the detail that makes the room hum. Representative Ilhan Omar is there too, off to the side, close enough that any camera can frame her with him. She's composed in the way politicians learn to be composed, but her hands betray the effort, clasped a little too tight for comfort. Everyone in those seats is doing the same quiet calculation. Why would she accept an invitation like this? And what exactly did the White House promise her? If this were a normal day, it would be an announcement, a pair of statements, a few questions, and a controlled exit. But the moment you put Trump and Omar in the same frame, you're not really scheduling a press conference. You're scheduling a collision. Trump opens with weather, because that's what he does when he wants to sound casual before he gets sharp. He calls it a beautiful day, cold but clear, and he lingers on the word clarity, like he's laying track for where he plans to drive this. Operation Clean Plate, he says. A major federal investigation, big agencies, big numbers, and he leans into the idea that something massive has been hiding in plain sight. He frames it around money meant for children and families, which is the fastest route to moral outrage in American politics. Then he turns and gestures toward Omar, naming her as Minnesota's representative, and you can feel the audience's attention lock onto her the way a spotlight locks onto a target. He starts tying the alleged problem to her district, her role, her legislative choices, and he does it with the smooth confidence of a performer who knows the camera will carry his tone as much as his words. He brings up the Meals Act of 2020 as the kind of policy that expanded flexibility during COVID-era disruptions, then suggests flexibility turned into a loophole big enough to drive a convoy through. He doesn't say, maybe. He doesn't say, it's complicated. He doesn't say, we'll let the courts decide. He says it like a story with a villain and a victim. But the smartest thing he does isn't the allegation itself. It's the structure. He tells the audience there will be questions, and he hints the media won't ask them. That turns every reporter in the Rose Garden into a supporting character in his script, and it sets him up as the only one brave enough to say what's really happening. Omar looks like she's ready to deliver her statement, the standard language about due process and not painting whole communities with one brush. Trump raises a hand and stops her with that calm authority that doesn't need to shout. And the room stiffens because everyone understands the implication. He says he'll ask questions first, as if the presidency comes with a built-in cross-examination feature. Then he drops a yes or no question that is designed less to inform than to corner. Did she know her bill could be exploited? In real life, policy doesn't work like fortune-telling. But on live television, yes or no is a weapon, because neither answer feels safe. Omar starts doing what politicians do when they're under attack. She talks about intent, about bad actors, about helping children during a crisis. Trump cuts it off and calls it a deflection, which is a word that plays well even when the situation is more tangled than a soundbite. He repeats the yes or no structure like a drumbeat, and the cameras keep tightening because conflict is what they were built for. If you're watching at home, you don't need a legal brief to understand the emotional math. The person asking questions looks in control, and the person answering looks reactive. That doesn't prove anything by itself, but it does shape how people feel, and feelings decide elections long before facts decide anything else. Trump pulls out a thick folder with colored tabs, the kind of visual that screams, "I came prepared," even if viewers never see the source material. He names people connected to Minnesota feeding program prosecutions and asks whether Omar knew them, whether she knew what they were doing, whether she was aware at the time. He leans hard on proximity, photos, appearances, events, public moments, because it's easier to argue about a photo than it is to argue about bureaucratic oversight. And that's the key question the audience is meant to wrestle with. In American politics, how much responsibility comes from association, and how much comes from actual conduct? Is it fair to treat "you were there" as "you knew," or is that just the oldest trick in the smear book? He pushes a second track, too. Not just who she knew, but what she said, how she praised programs, how she framed them, how she positioned herself as a champion for aid. If fraud prosecutions exist in that orbit, then the optics are ugly, because voters don't love the idea of leaders celebrating something that later looks tainted. But optics aren't proof, and "later" doesn't automatically mean "at the time," which is why the questions become the whole product. Did she have reason to suspect wrongdoing? And if so, what did she do about it? And if not, why not? And if the system was vulnerable, why did it take so long for the vulnerabilities to be addressed in a way that felt decisive? Then the story shifts to money, because money is where America turns suspicion into obsession. Trump references public financial disclosures and the shock people feel when a politician's reported ranges jump dramatically. He contrasts the image of a working mom narrative with a later disclosure that suggests a much higher net worth range, and he asks which portrayal the public is supposed to trust. But the honest way to talk about disclosures is to admit they're imprecise. Ranges are broad, valuations can be disputed, and spousal assets can create confusing snapshots. So the skepticism has to be aimed at explanation, not accusation. What changed? What was revalued? What documentation supports the new numbers? And why do the narratives sound so different? He brings up spousal business interests, how campaigns pay vendors, how spouses sometimes run those vendors, how that looks to voters even when it's reported properly. He points to lawsuits and court filings as if they settle the matter. But filings are the beginning of a dispute, not the end. And anyone serious knows that. Still, it's a potent line of attack because it plays into a bipartisan disgust. The sense that Washington is full of people who treat public service like a revenue stream. And that's where the questions land hardest. If the payments were legitimate, what services were delivered? What rates were comparable? And why did the totals look so high to outsiders? If everything is clean, then detail is your friend. So why does the story always sound like it's being told through fog? The narrative then drifts into personal life controversy, Because political storytelling can't resist anything that sounds like a tabloid headline. A divorce petition, a timeline, an allegation of a relationship, and the inevitable insinuation that money and romance overlapped in a way that feels suspicious. But personal chaos doesn't automatically equal public corruption, and it's irresponsible to pretend it does without proof. The fair question isn't who did what in private. It's did any private conduct intersect with official decisions, campaign spending, or disclosure obligations in a way that should have been handled differently? If the answer is no, the story collapses into gossip. If the answer is yes, the story becomes about governance, not romance. Trump, in the constructed scene, treats it all as one rope: fraud prosecutions, legislative oversight, appearances, vendors, finances, and personal drama braided into a single narrative of something isn't right. That's how political takedowns are built. Not one smoking gun, but a pile of smoke that makes people assume fire. The viewer's brain does the rest, filling in gaps with whatever they already believe about Trump, Omar, Democrats, Republicans, immigration, or the system. And that's the real plot here. The contest isn't just over facts, it's over what kind of story the public will accept as plausible. Because in America, plausibility often beats precision, and precision gets called spin by whichever side doesn't like the conclusion. If you're writing this for voiceover, the tension comes from pacing and questions, not from declaring verdicts. What did she know? When did she know it? And what should a representative reasonably be expected to know in a chaotic emergency period? When the government expands programs fast, does it also expand guardrails fast enough? And who owns the consequences when criminals exploit the gaps? If oversight fails, is that the fault of one sponsor, or the fault of the whole machine that passed it, staffed it, and administered it? And why is it always easier to argue about a politician's character than to fix the incentives that keep producing the same kinds of scandals? By the time the scene reaches its climax, the audience isn't even listening for a specific answer anymore. They're listening for a moment, an expression, a pause, a stumble that can be clipped, shared, and turned into a conclusion. Trump keeps asking yes or no because he's not chasing truth. He's chasing a frame that forces a reaction. Omar keeps trying to widen the answer because she's not trying to entertain. She's trying to avoid a trap that was designed for entertainment. And the press, stuck in the middle, becomes a mirror of the country, half convinced they're watching accountability, half convinced they're watching theater, and everyone convinced they can't look away. In the end, the story you're building isn't Trump proves X, because proving is what courts do, not what podiums do. The story is Trump stages a confrontation that makes millions of people feel like questions were finally asked out loud, whether those questions were fair, complete, or weaponized. It's the political equivalent of tapping a fish tank and watching everything inside start swimming in panic. The questions linger, and that's the point. Because lingering questions are reusable, and reusable questions are how modern outrage stays profitable. And the uncomfortable thought you leave the listener with is this: if one dramatic performance can reshape reputations overnight, how many reputations have been built or broken by performance alone? The problem is, once a scene like this starts rolling, there's no clean way to stop it. You can't rewind a live moment, and you can't unhear a question once it's been asked in front of a crowd that's already decided it sounds true. Trump knows that, which is why he keeps the tempo moving like a drummer who doesn't want the audience to have time to think. He doesn't need a courtroom. He needs a clip. And he doesn't need a conviction. He needs a contrast. So he does what he always does. He turns from the person to the people. He looks past Omar and addresses the press rows like he's hosting a town hall where every chair is occupied by a skeptic. He talks about working Americans, about families who pay taxes, about kids who don't get second chances. And he uses that familiar cadence that makes his supporters nod before they even know what they're nodding at. He leans into outrage, but the outrage is carefully packaged, less a scream, more a guided tour through a set of carefully chosen impressions. And in that moment, even people who don't like him can recognize the skill. He's selling certainty in a market that's exhausted by uncertainty. Omar, for her part, is stuck in the oldest political dilemma on Earth. If you swing back hard, you look defensive. If you stay calm, you look weak. She tries to keep her eyes level, tries to anchor herself in procedure, tries to speak like someone who expects institutions to matter. That sounds noble in a civics textbook, but this isn't a civics textbook. This is an outdoor stage with winter sunlight and 4K zoom lenses and producers begging for a reaction shot. And procedures don't trend, faces do. The next questions come with that same simple framing that is never simple in real life. What did you know? When did you know it? Who told you? Why didn't you act sooner? Why didn't you demand audits? Why did you appear at events connected, however loosely, to people later charged in public cases? Each question is just plausible enough to make viewers lean in, and just broad enough that any answer can be painted as a dodge. This is how political pressure works when it's designed for an audience. It's not about reaching an answer, it's about keeping the target on their heels. And if you're watching, you can almost predict the rhythm. Question, pause, interruption, label the response a talking point, then move on before nuance can breathe. Somewhere in the middle of this, you can imagine a smart reporter wanting to step in with the boring but essential follow-ups. What is Operation Clean Plate specifically? What statutes? What agencies? What jurisdiction? What timeline? Are we talking about policy oversight failures, or about individual wrongdoing, or about administrative gaps that were exploited in a crisis? What's being alleged here, and what's being inferred, and what's simply being implied for dramatic effect? But the reporters don't control the microphone. And even if they did, boring but essential is not the currency of a live spectacle. Trump keeps returning to numbers because numbers sound like objectivity, even when they're presented selectively. He emphasizes big totals and dramatic ranges, and the phrase public record, like it's a stamp that ends the debate. The truth is, public records can raise questions without answering them, and numbers can be true while the story attached to them is incomplete. But he's not pitching completeness. He's pitching inevitability. He wants the viewer to feel like the conclusion is already here, and only the formalities are left. That's when the room starts to split into camps, even among professionals. Some people interpret the confrontation as overdue accountability, the kind of thing they wish would happen to every politician with messy optics. Other people see a political trap, a staged humiliation designed to generate a week of headlines and a year of fundraising. And then there's the third group, the biggest group, who doesn't care which interpretation is correct as long as the clip is satisfying. That's the audience modern politics is built for. The people who don't demand proof. They demand payoff. Omar tries to pivot back to principles. Due process, fairness, not punishing communities for the actions of individuals. That's a reasonable point in the abstract, and it's also a point that can be twisted in a hostile frame. Because the moment she says community, Trump can act like she's hiding behind identity. The moment she says due process, he can act like she's trying to stall. The moment she says we need facts, He can gesture at the folder like facts are already stacked on the podium. It's a rigged chessboard, and the rigging isn't illegal. It's theatrical. Meanwhile, the cameras do what cameras always do. They hunt for the smallest crack. A swallow, a tight jaw, a glance toward a staffer, a half-step from a lawyer who realizes he can't stand too close without becoming part of the story. None of these things prove anything, but they signal stress, and stress reads as guilt to an audience that already wants a villain. It's not fair, but it's human, and politics feeds on human shortcuts. The irony is that underneath the spectacle is a real, unglamorous question America never answers cleanly. How do emergency programs get built fast without inviting abuse? During crises, government moves money quickly because waiting has a cost too. If you build tight controls, people suffer delays. If you build loose controls, you risk exploitation. That trade-off doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, but it's the heart of the matter. And if you're being honest, you can criticize Omar's policy choices, or anyone's, without claiming they intended abuse, because intent is the part you don't get to assume. The crowd doesn't want that conversation, though, not in the moment. They want the showdown. They want the gotcha. They want the crisp line that makes one person look powerful and the other person look trapped. And Trump, sensing it like a shark senses vibration, tightens the script again. He repeats the questions, compresses the language, and speaks like a man offering only two doors. Admit you knew, or admit you failed. At some point, Omar's expression shifts, not into confession, not into collapse, but into something more relatable and more dangerous for her politically. Annoyance. Not outrage, not fear. Annoyance. The face of someone thinking, "This is ridiculous." It's a normal human reaction, and it's the kind of reaction that gets clipped and used against you forever. Because annoyance can be framed as arrogance, and arrogance is a faster story than policy. And if you're a politician, you learn the hard way that your face is not yours once the cameras are rolling. Trump ends up where he always ends up, presenting himself as the guy willing to say what others won't, the outsider inside the building, the prosecutor without the courtroom. He talks like he's speaking on behalf of people who feel played by elites. He hints at more documents, more questions, more revelations, because the promise of more is how you keep an audience from clicking away. And the press corps, professional, trained, jaded, still falls into the gravity of it, because gravity isn't about agreement. It's about force. Even the reporters who think it's unfair can't deny it's dominating the day. Then the scene pivots outward, away from the rose garden and into the places where politics gets real in quieter ways. A teacher in Minneapolis who has lived through budget cuts and broken promises looks at the headlines and wonders not who wins the argument, but whether kids eat tomorrow. A small business owner who pays taxes and doesn't have a lawyer on speed dial hears fraud and millions and thinks about how quickly the system comes down on ordinary people for much less. A community leader hears the same story and worries that a legitimate concern, oversight, will turn into a blunt instrument used to stigmatize people who did nothing wrong. And everyone, in their own way, becomes suspicious of everyone else, which is exactly how trust collapses without anyone firing a shot. That's the aftertaste of a political spectacle. It doesn't just target one person. It teaches the audience a lesson about how power works, how questions can be used like weapons, how documents can be used like props, how certainty can be sold like a product. Maybe the questions raised deserve answers. Maybe some of the optics deserve scrutiny. Maybe some of the systems deserve reform. But there's also a darker possibility sitting right there in the cold January air, that the whole point isn't answers at all. that the point is to make every institution look dirty, every opponent look guilty, and every viewer feel like the only safe place left is whichever team they already chose. And that's where the narrator, if the narrator wants to sound like a real American voice and not a courtroom stenographer, leans in with the uncomfortable punchline. Because the strangest part isn't Trump pressing Omar in public. The strangest part is how easily the country accepts public pressure as a substitute for public clarity. How quickly a folder becomes proof. How quickly a pause becomes guilt. How quickly a question becomes a verdict. And how, on the next cold, clear day, the same machinery will turn to a new target, with a new set of tabs, and half the audience will cheer, while the other half swears it's a witch hunt. So the final question hangs there, sharper than the winter air. If you love this kind of moment when it's aimed at your enemy, what happens when it's aimed at someone you like? Do you still call it accountability? Or do you suddenly remember that accusations aren't conclusions? Do you still demand yes or no answers? Or do you start asking for nuance and context and boring details? Because if the standard changes based on who's on stage, then the standard isn't a standard. It's just a weapon. And once politics becomes nothing but weapons, nobody walks away unbloodied, even if all that's spilled is credibility.